Eaves. I'm an open data activist. I've been thinking about and arguing for open data for a couple of years now. I advise the, so I'm just going to stop. I don't actually have slides up, so just want to check with the people back there to make sure I'm supposed to be doing a Ignite talk, so you're supposed to be hearing me talk really, really quickly at you. But without my slides, that kind of begins to fall apart. See, I just stole a whole bunch of extra time. So my name's David Eaves. I already advised the mayor of Vancouver, and I also helped write the Open Motion, which launched kind of open data in Vancouver, and on top of that, launched a site called data.dot.gc.ca because the federal government wouldn't create a portal, so we decided to create one for them. One of the things I want to talk to you about is how important history is. I think when it comes to open data, we have a lot of kind of dangerous myths, but also some powerful stories if we look to the past. I'm a student of history. I've done my undergrad in history, and I think that the key lesson I want to pass on to you is I actually think open data is old. And I think open government is old. And we need to think about that because there's a lot of people not in this room, who are not comfortable with some of the things that we're talking about. And when we talk about new things, disruptive things, it makes them nervous. So I like old stories. And so one of the greatest is actually written by this guy here, Michael Lewis, who wrote a fantastic book called Moneyball. I can't recommend it enough, where he talked about how open data transformed the baseball industry. And he talks about this guy who was in the middle of nowhere. He was a night watchman by the name of Billy James. He wrote a book that 75 people bought with a title, and I kid you not, that is the title of the book right there. And it basically looked at baseball stats, and it completely reassessed how we understand the sport. He said he looked at things like hitting, and he said, what is a hitting percentage? And a lot of people thought, well, the number of times you hit the ball, and he said, well, that's interesting, but it's not as important as how many times you get on base, because that's what advances the game, and a hitting percentage doesn't count the number of times you get walked. And so he began to write about how we need to rethink baseball. And it almost didn't matter until these guys came along and their manager, Billy Jean, read his material, understood it, and said, hey, we need to begin to apply this here. And he began to create a team that began to expose and exploit the way this type of data could find players. And he began to create a roster that was able to build a winning team on a fraction of the cost. And if you were looking at your government, wouldn't you want a government that was able to deliver those types of results on that kind of payroll versus what other governments were producing? And this is what he was able to do. The interesting thing about the story is Billy Jean first began to write his book even before 1985. In fact, in 1985, he complained about the fact that all he had was box scores. He didn't even have that much data. He had to kind of run around and kind of grab it. In 1985, that began to change. Some of the companies out there, Sabermetrics, began to expose some of the data behind baseball so you could begin to see what different players were doing. He began to analyze in a more robust way. But it took from 78 to 85 for him to even just begin to get the data. And you have to understand that Billy Jean didn't become the general manager of the Oakland A's until 1997. There's a huge amount of time there. And one of the reasons why I like this story is because, A, it shows us all the kind of problems that happen around open data. A, it actually takes time for these things to happen. Everybody thinks that if we begin to share our data tomorrow, things are going to happen magically. Sometimes we win the lottery and that happens. But the real disruptive change is the thing that happens over time. It's not when people just begin to build apps using your data. It's when they start telling you how you can do your job better. When the night clerk who works nothing but in the evenings all of a sudden discovers he knows something that you don't know, and he can make you save millions and millions of dollars. We have been here before. We have stories that we can learn from, stories that we can explain to other people. And it's not just in baseball. It's all across government. This number for me strikes me as really important. I had a friend in Canada who began to look at all of the charities in the Toronto area, began to analyze how much money they were raising. And as she looked at it, she discovered, the United Way was supposed to be the biggest charity in Canada in the Toronto area. And she was like, well, that's interesting. So she began to look at all the stats. And what did she discover? That when she began to break down how much money each charity was gathering, the United Way was actually not the biggest charity in Canada. It was actually the third largest. And what puzzled her about this is she had been working in the charitable sector for 20 years now, and she didn't even know who these guys were. And the reason she didn't know who those guys were was because they were just tax frauds. These were people who were collecting money illegally to create tax evasion schemes. So this number here, this $3.2 billion, that represents the total amount of lost revenue to the Canadian federal government. $3.2 billion. Not a lot of money in the United States, but that represents about 0.4% of the Canadian federal budget writ large. This is 0.4% of the Canadian federal budget writ large. So we already have stories. And in fact, we even have stories around how we create data. Citizens are already creating data. We don't have to talk about what it's going to look like in the future. If you look at the most common service, the one that citizens love the most, think of 911. Citizens every single day are creating data using 911 because they're helping us deliver with pinpoint accuracy the most critical service that people want. They tell us where the cops need to be, where the ambulance needs to be. Those guys, they sometimes show up at the right place, but they rely on us. We create the data already. So we have a history of doing open government. We have a history of open data. Let's stop talking about this as being new and disruptive. Let's start talking about this as being old and make it safe for the people who aren't in this room to engage what we're doing. Thank you so much.